Greetings, everyone. I'm William Vincent. I am a Eastern Orthodox Christian and a lay preacher and apologist for the Orthodox faith. I'm presently in a debate with Mr. Don K. Preston about the topic of Daniel 7:13 and 14, and whether or not that is fulfilled in the ascension as it is related in Acts chapter 1, the eyewitnesses of the apostles, or whether, according to Don Preston, that those passages do not indeed relate to Daniel, uh, to the ascension. Daniel 7:13-14 does not relate to the ascension. And this will be the second installment for me. I've made a presentation. Mr. President Preston has also made a presentation. In this presentation, I'll be responding to Mr. Preston and his first affirmation. I will begin by saying that I was rather confused by Mr. Preston's presentation. And I'll say that I was confused because it seemed as though he affirmed most of what we're debating about. In other words, he seemed to affirm my proposition. In fact, at one point during the video, he actually says every single point that Mr. Vincent presented, I agree with in principle. As a matter of fact, and he goes on at great length to affirm that the Son of Man had to have received his kingdom at the ascension, and that his Son of Man had to be glorified in his ascension. He's adamant that he's not denying that. As a matter of fact, at one point, during one of his major points, he argues that the fourth beast is the Roman Empire. And he makes the statement, he says that the saints that are being persecuted by the fourth beast must be kingdom saints. They must be saints of the kingdom. Now, if they have to be kingdom saints, and he says that the Roman army is the fourth beast, doesn't that mean that Christ has to have already received his kingdom before the persecution of the kingdom saints? How do we have kingdom saints if Christ has not already received his kingdom? That seems to concede the point to me. Several times throughout this presentation, it seems to me that Mr. Preston actually concedes the point that the Son of Man is glorified and receives his kingdom in the ascension. Now, this idea of persecution of the saints seems to be a major theme with him. And this idea that he seems to emphasize the fourth beast as the Roman army, or the Roman Empire being the fourth kingdom. Now, I will have to say here, I personally don't deviate from that. I personally see the fourth beast as the Roman Empire. I know that there are others who see that differently. But in the scope of this debate, in the scope of this discussion, if we concede Mr. Preston's point that the fourth beast is the Roman Empire, and perhaps the little horn, I think maybe most people with that view would say is Nero, does that not mean that Christ had to have received his kingdom and be glorified before the kingdom saints are being persecuted, which they're being persecuted throughout the New Testament narrative? I think it does. It seems to be a concession on his point. I don't think that makes the point he needs it to make. In fact, I think that makes an opposite point to what he's trying to establish. So he makes this idea of persecution being huge, but he establishes the fact that there has to be saints in the kingdom in order for kingdom saints to be being persecuted. Now, while it was not originally within the scope of our debate to begin with, Mr. Preston brings forth a very important psalm. Psalm in the Orthodox Old Testament, it's 109. In the standard Protestant Bibles, it's 110. It's very important, and I absolutely and adamantly agree with Mr. Preston that this is one of the most important psalms of the Old Testament. It is perhaps the fabric of the apostles' eschatology and their view and their explanation of the events of the New Testament. It is the reason for their anticipation of the events that are about to unfold. I absolutely agree with that. But yet again, I don't think this proves what Mr. Preston needs for it to prove. I think it proves something totally different than what he needs for it to prove. Look at this. I'm going to read that to you. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord shall send forth the rod of your power from Zion, and rule in the midst of your enemies. With you is the beginning in the day. With you is the beginning in the day of your power, in the brightness of your saints. Remember, Mr. Preston says that this beast in Daniel 7 has to be persecuting kingdom saints. But here we read that the Lord sitting on the right hand, ascended into heaven. Clearly, Mr. Preston believes that this is the ascension. He says as much as in his presentation. It is because of the ascension. It is because of this that his enemies, in the prophet David says in the psalm, because of this, his enemies will be made his footstool. And that Christ, and we assuming the fulfillment of prophecy being Christ, would rule in the midst of his enemies. Not only that, he would send forth the rod of judgment. And in that is the brightness and the vindication of the saints. Then he goes on, the Lord, and we talked about the priest, the Lord, well, let's read it. I have begotten you from the womb before the morning star. The Lord swore and will not repent. You are priests forever according to the order of Melchizedek, which talks about the New Testament priesthood that begins to unfold there. It clearly is inaugurated. In the book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews predicates the New Testament worship on this passage, that he is a priest forever. He's not of the line of Aaron. And the New Testament royal priesthood is predicated on Melchizedek. This has to be a reality, clearly. Clearly it has to be a reality during the narrative scope of the New Testament. Verse 5, the Lord at your right hand crushed kings in the day of his wrath. Kings, plural kings. You'll see this in the book of Revelation. I don't have time to go into that in this particular debate. But look at the conquering king in Revelation. He goes forth to make war with the nations. He is a conquering king, and he is conquering by the word of his mouth. You will crush kings in the day of your wrath. He shall judge among the nations. He shall fill them with dead bodies. He shall crush the head of many on earth. He shall drink the brook on the way, therefore he shall rise his head. So what we see in Psalm 110, this is a very important psalm, and it's important to this debate. It's because Mr. Preston, being a full preterist, attaches a soteriological value, or at least a ecclesiological value, to 70 AD, as though until, and that is one of the reasons this debate is crucial. Because he needs, as a full preterist, the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD to link with the glorification of the Son of Man. And it needs to add something to the church. It needs to add something to Christ and his kingdom. Let me say this. The fall of Jerusalem is certainly related to the ascension of the Son of Man. It's related right here. It certainly correlates. It is not the glorification of the Son of Man. And this psalm that Mr. Preston brings forth illustrates the reason why it cannot be. Because in order for God to judge among the nations through the Lord at his right hand, the Lord has to be seated at his right hand. In order for Jerusalem to fall as being judged among one of the nations, the Lord has to be seated on the right hand of power and the glory and the majesty on high. So, the Lord can't be being seated in 70 AD if the judgment that precedes is because of his ascension. This Psalm 110, 109 in the Orthodox Old Testament, 110, makes Mr. Preston's theory yet again impossible. if this judgment, and this is particularly, and it'll be a bit off the scope of this debate, but if when Jerusalem is judged by the Lord sitting at the right hand of the Father, she is judged as one of the nations. She is judged as one of the nations, which is so important because it demonstrates that the Lord's covenant was no longer. What did he say in John 4? The day is coming, the hour is coming where you will not worship in Jerusalem or in the mountain of Samaria, for God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So the fact that Jerusalem, who had made itself an enemy of the people of God, was judged by the prophetic word of Christ as one of the nations, shows that the Lord's covenant was no longer in Jerusalem or in the mountain of Samaria, but that it is in spirit and in truth, with the people who worship him in spirit and in truth. It's absolutely correlated to the ascension of Christ. Okay? It's absolutely and powerfully related to the word of Christ. It is very interesting. The Christ in the Olivet prophecy prophesies as an Old Testament prophet, in the essence of an Old Testament prophet, the fall of Jerusalem. But he brings it to pass as God on the right hand of God. He both prophesies and brings it to pass. He is the prophet that proclaims the word, and he is the God that executes the word. An amazing, amazing scenario there. And that is the transition, the transaction that is happening in the New Testament, what is being revealed. And this is what we said in our first affirmation, that is what was being revealed to the apostles and revealed to the early church, that the Son of Man was present. He was fulfilling the law by never breaking it, never sinning against it. He was. What does Romans 7 say? He that is dead is free from the law. So he, in his crucifixion, is free. The power of the law of Moses no longer has power over him. He ascends into heaven, receives the covenant in this manner, being the only heir and son of Abraham. He's an heir of Abraham that is perfect and obedient, but he is also a son of Abraham that is not bound under the law, because the law only has power over man as long as he lives. So he receives the inheritance of the covenant, free from the law, and establishes the new covenant. Very important. But because he has ascended to the right hand of the Father, because he sits on the right hand of glory, he is able to judge. The Psalm said you will judge kings in the day of your wrath. In the book of Revelation, he is a conquering king going forth to conquer. He's crowned, he's glorified, which is very important. But here we see that Psalm 110, as Mr. Preston brings it forth, doesn't establish the fact that Christ could not be glorified until his enemies were judged, but that he had to be glorified before his enemies were judged. The judgment of his enemies is predicated upon the fact that he's ascended to heaven and that he's glorified. The fall of Jerusalem has to take place by the prophetic word, by the sword in the revelation that comes from his mouth, the prophetic word, because it is a vindication that he has ascended into heaven. My personal understanding of Matthew 24 is particularly when he said, "And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven." And I said, I know even some of the fathers of the church indicate that at the consummation there will be a sign, but they also acknowledge that this is not speaking of Christ himself, but it's a sign of Christ. But I think that there is a imminent fulfillment of that, in that the fall of Jerusalem in this prophecy that he just gave is in itself a signification that he is in heaven. It is a sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. What did the Old Testament say? You know a prophet if his word comes to pass. You know that he is who he says he is if his words come to pass. And Christ makes a prophecy about the fall of Jerusalem. And because Jerusalem falls as an enemy of the church, it is a vindication and a glorification not just of Christ, who's already glorified, already ascended to heaven, already at the right hand of the Father. Otherwise, Jerusalem was not judged in that manner. But it is a vindication of the kingdom saints, who me and Mr. Preston both agree have to be kingdom saints before this event takes place. It is justification of them because they have been faithful to his word. and that he has proven to be true to them even through persecution. So Psalm 110 does not alleviate the tension for Mr. Preston. It doesn't alleviate the tension. It creates even a greater tension. And it only, to me, justifies and substantiates what I originally proposed. That the Son of Man is glorified and receives his kingdom at the ascension. So I don't see how Psalm 110 particularly aids Mr. Preston in his point. Now, as Mr. Preston goes through his presentation, this narrative of persecution and preceding the glorification of the Son of Man, which nothing he presented really gave that impression. But that he has made that one of his major points, if not the major point. In doing this, and taking us away from this text back to Daniel 7 itself, Mr. Preston assumes, and he doesn't say as much, but you can, as you hear his presentation, he assumes or makes the assumption that Daniel 7 and the visions and the events of Daniel 7 have to be chronological in their order. In other words, everything that is mentioned in Daniel 7 has to proceed chronologically. In other words, because the fourth beast is mentioned before this glorification of the Son of Man in 13 and 14, then that means the beast has to persecute the church or the kingdom saints before the glorification of the Son of Man. That's simply a mistake. And we've shown in Scripture why even the psalm that he himself brought forth shows why that's not the case. The visions of Daniel 7 particularly, because that's the scope of our debate, the visions of Daniel 7 certainly correlate. They certainly correlate. They're interrelated. They relate one to another. But because they correlate does not mean they are chronological. In other words, just because that the kingdom saints are being persecuted by the little horn at the beginning of this chapter does not mean that the glorification of the Son of Man has to happen after that. It simply doesn't mean that. As a matter of fact, Mr. Preston, in some of his own assertions, would have to agree. He would have to agree that the saints have received their kingdom in the beginning of the 7th chapter of Daniel in order for them to be persecuted as kingdom saints. He has to concede that himself. So he may or may not, but he should concede that because that's only logical and rational. And if it's logical and rational for him to assert that the saints that are being persecuted are the kingdom saints, then it's also, and that they've already received the kingdom, it's also rational to assume that the one who is glorified in 7, 13, and 14 has already received his kingdom at the point in time when this little horn is persecuting. So he assumes that it has to be in order, and that's the reason for him it's a slam dunk. It's a done deal. You see that there's the persecution, there's the war, and then here's this glorification. He's assuming that these events happen in a chronological order rather than they are correlating events. I would say giving us multiple angles of the same historical time period. Daniel is showing us the beast that's persecuting. Daniel is showing us the little horn. He's showing us the saints. He's showing us the seating for judgment. He's showing us the exalted Son of Man. He's showing us the kingdom that will not be moved. But it says almost as we're just getting pictures as the Spirit moves his mind and reveals to him through these visions. But he's not giving the Holy Spirit through Daniel is not giving us a timeline of A, B, C, D. That's not how that works. And if it were so to be so, I contend that what Mr. Preston himself has presented makes that impossible. But if Mr. Preston is going to assert that Daniel 7 has to be a chronological timeline, he needs to prove that for us. And he's going to have to, in order to prove that to us and for us, he's going to not only have to go back and show what I presented in my first presentation, how that contradicts. Why should that contradict that? In other words, why should the apostles be saying the Son of Man is glorified and received his kingdom if he hasn't? He's going to have to go back and explain to us why his own assertions don't align with his assumption about Daniel 7? Why his own assertions that they have to be kingdom saints, that the Son of Man has already been glorified and received his kingdom? Why don't they align with Daniel 7? The reality is that is a mistake. It is a mistake that Daniel 7 is a chronological timeline. Daniel 7 is visions, pictures, images that are being revealed about the day of the Son of Man. And Daniel 7, 13, and 14 is the emphasis, it is the crux, it is the moment. If it were a drama, if it were a play, that is the crux of the entire story, is that one like a Son of Man is brought before the Ancient of Days, and he receives a kingdom, and he receives glory and honor and dominion. That is the climax of the story. The images bring us to that point in the story. But Mr. Preston would say, well, this has to be I'm assuming he would. He never said as much in his presentation, to be fair, but his presentation itself seemed to assume that this has to be a timeline rather than images and pictures built around and surrounding this concept of one like a Son of Man was brought before the Ancient of Days, was given glory and dominion and a kingdom. Now, one of the things I never really heard from Mr. Preston throughout the whole of his presentation is why we should not think Daniel 7, 13, and 14 is not the ascension. Other than he puts this forth about this persecution. That was the only substantive point, or substantive point, that he brought forth, even though I've just shown why that doesn't work, was that he said, well, there has to be a persecution before this happens. We've shown why that doesn't work. It doesn't work exegetically. It doesn't work scripturally. It doesn't harmonize with what the gospel narrative presents. So that one point has been set aside. So why do we not need to believe Daniel 7, 13, and 14 is the ascension and glorification of the Son of Man, when Mr. Preston himself has said many times in his presentation that the Son of Man had been glorified, and that Daniel 7 assumes the ascension. In other words, Mr. Preston himself realizes that without the ascension, Daniel 7 makes no sense. Let me say that again. He himself realizes that we need the ascension in Daniel 7 for it to work. But then he goes along and says, but it's not there. It's not actually spoken about, even though we have Daniel 7, 13, and 14. Now I ask you, those that listen along, does that not seem a bit contrived? Is that not a bit contrived? Then why would we go so far and work so hard to make Daniel 7, 13, and 14 not the ascension? That's very, very interesting. And I think the reason why is, again, Mr. Preston and the full preterists can't realize that if Daniel 7:13, I saw one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven before the Ancient of Days, if this refers to the ascension, it unravels the greatest part of the foundation of full preterism. Because full preterism is built on the assumption that the time text of what they call time text refer to the second coming of Christ, or the return of Christ from heaven, or the consummate return of Christ. They assume that that's what it refers to, when we can show that it does. They do not refer to that. Seeing the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, receiving his kingdom, seeing his kingdom established with power, we can show, and we have shown, refers to the ascension and the glorification of the Son of Man. As a matter of fact, everything that Mr. Preston has presented only strengthens what we originally asserted. Now I'm getting close to the end of this, and I wanted to bring out something that's very important. The timeline of the glorification of the Son of Man. Now Mr. Preston, I believe, makes a correlation to Daniel 7 and the book of Revelation. I thought that's interesting, and I wanted to take us to the book of Revelation. And if you read, I want you to read Daniel 7, and particularly the seating of the Ancient of Days and the description of the Ancient of Days. And then I want you to go to Revelation And I want you to read the description of the Son of Man in the first chapter. And this is important. I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to explain this point. And now you understand the context of the chapter, so I'm not going to go into that. So we just jump right into it. He says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice as of a trumpet, saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. What you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. Then I turned to see the voice that spoke with me, and having turned, I saw the 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands, one like the Son of Man, clothed with a garment to the feet, and girded about the chest with a golden band. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes like a flame of fire. His feet were like fine brass, as if it refined in a furnace. His voice the sound of many waters. And he had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword, and his countenance was like the sun shining in its strength. And when I saw him, I fell down at his feet as the word did. It is important, and I don't have time to go back to Daniel 7 because I'm running out of time, but I would like you to read it as well, the description of the Ancient of Days. In the opening chapter of the book of Revelation, the revelation of Jesus Christ, we see the Son of Man described as with a descriptive language of the Ancient of Days. In other words, the Son of Man, the one like the Son of Man, is described the same way the Ancient of Days is in Daniel 7. He's described both as the Son of Man and with the descriptive qualities of the Ancient of Days, showing that he is fully God and fully man. That's exactly what that reveals there. But this is the important point as we get to the end of this presentation. At the beginning of the revelation, at the time John is brought up into the Spirit on the Lord's day, before, some would say after 70, I still believe that the book of Revelation was written the early day, and I know Mr. Preston does. The Son of Man is already glorified. He is already described as the likeness of the Ancient of Days. At the beginning of this chapter, as he talks about the king, it is this Son of Man that goes forth to conquer. It is this Son of Man that goes forth to make war with the nations. And the first nation to fall, the first enemy to be dealt with, the first kingdom to crumble in the wake of the power of the ascended Christ, the word of his prophecy, the sword that comes from his mouth. The first is Jerusalem. The first is Jerusalem. The Ancient of Days, the Son of Man is already glorified. He's already glorified, and John sees him glorified at the beginning of the Revelation. And to me, that absolutely seals the point. I want to hear Mr. Preston respond to this. I know me and him both hold an early date. I think some of my colleagues may hold a late date. That's fine. But for me and him, we both agree the early date, and we both see this as pre-70 AD. And because we both see this as pre-70 AD, how is the Son of Man already described in the glorified terms of Daniel 7 if, according to Mr. Preston, he is not glorified until 70 AD? It seems not to align. So with that, I give you my second presentation. I look forward to hearing what Mr. Preston has to say, and I appreciated the discussion thus far. Again, all these things are for the glory of Jesus Christ, and at the end of the day, we want to worship him and exalt him and lift him up and proclaim him to the world, glorified, risen, ascended. So with that, I'll leave you with that prayer on my heart and that agreement that the Holy Spirit himself will lead each one of us into the fullness of the truth. I only have a few seconds here left, so I'm going to cut it a bit short. I don't want to just fill up time for no reason. God blessings to each and every one of you. Have a wonderful day and a great week.